My name is Sarchil Qader. I am a senior research fellow at Wallpop. So today I will be talking to you about some of my recent work that has been going on for some time over the last few years, developing some methodology around geospatial techniques, region merging algorithm for supporting census, particularly around national sampling frame. This project and tools has been funded by different organizations, funding bodies, including Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, World Bank, UNHCR. We have been working very closely with the UNFPA since they are leading most of the census around the world, and FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and the GRID 3 program that we have been part of it since its start. Just briefly, Wallpop is a research group within the University of Southampton. Our primary focus is producing gridded population dataset at the global scale. We also model various population characteristics ranging from socioeconomic indicators such as poverty, maternal and access to health facilities, and child health indicators such as vaccination coverage. And also some of my colleagues are working on modeling population mobility. So far, I think we have produced more than 45 or 50,000 geospatial dataset on our website within this research area, and it can be used for different applications and policy-making decisions. But today, I am here more specifically to talk about the type of work that I do with some of my colleagues. So when it comes to the national sampling frame, I think we all refer to the source of this data, which always comes from the census. However, as you can see from this map, which is not very up to date, that census has not been conducted in quite a few countries around the world. And even if census is conducted, then because of the demographic change, the national sampling frame or any other data set that has been collected through census will be outdated, because in some countries, census will be conducted once in 10 years or 5 years, depending on the country's strategy. So it's always crucial to have alternative methodology that you can update the data set that comes from the census. So when it comes to the national sampling frame, we always hear about a terminology that may have different names in different countries, which is the enumeration area, which are the operational geographic unit for the collection and dissemination of census data, and are often used as a national sampling frame for various types of socioeconomic survey. There are some challenges when it comes to the creation of this geographic unit. And those challenges in general are in some countries that we don't actually have this data set. For example, we worked with DRC. We have created a national sampling frame now, but previously there was no digitized national sampling frame or enumeration area. In some country, you may have the enumeration area, but they might be extremely outdated or incomplete. And because of the constant change in demographic factors, there's always a need to update the enumeration area. However, a lot of countries are relying on the manual approach, which is extremely resource intensive. And also we have seen in some circumstances, like during the COVID or areas that we call them fragile, conflict and violent regions, access may be restricted. So we may need to basically look for alternative approach or a hybrid approach that could be used in such a situation to advance census preparation or surveys that you're planning to do in a country. In quite few countries, they are still relying on the manual approach. And the problem with the manual approach, obviously, I just want to emphasize on one thing, that it's not the purpose of this presentation or our tool that we exclude the manual approach entirely. We just think that a combination of manual approach and automatic approach for creating the national sampling frame or enumeration area could be a viable solutions. So when it comes to the manual approach, we always end up having quite a lot of geometric issues. So when it comes to the enumeration area, it has to be nested within administrative boundaries, but sometimes if it's manually delineated, sometimes they are not nested within administrative boundaries. And when we are talking about the enumeration area, we are talking about 100,000 polygons, and they have to be all adjacent. Of course, there are tools within GIS software, but when it comes to the manual approach, it's just sometimes difficult. And because of this reason, and because it's manually done, we always end up having a lot of pocket disjoints and overlap. The other critical issue with the manual approach is that it's always hard to draw a polygon and consider the homogeneity in terms of the population size or household size and area across the entire country, because that's not possible and it will be quite a challenge. And when we talk about the enumeration area, it has to cover the entire country, but with the manual approach, that could be quite challenging. Sometimes you miss some area and that will create an issue for the data collection. And as I said, the manual approach in general is time and resource intensive. So national sampling frame is actually the key and essential driver to obtain reliable and representative data. So even though if you have developed a most accurate and reliable approach to collect your data on the ground, but if the selected household that you are planning to enumerate came from a national sampling frame, which is not representative or outdated, it means you are introducing a huge bias in your data, particularly in the socioeconomic survey, because in the socioeconomic surveys, you all know that we are not basically enumerating every single household. We are just enumerating a small percentage. So that small percentage that we are enumerating need to be representative, and we should basically avoid missing any subgroup within our survey. So there are some actually challenges and problems within the existing national sampling frame that we have. When it comes to the digital national sampling frame, generally, quite a lot of researchers are using three types of data set. There might be others. These data sets are either the census enumeration area, if you are lucky and have access to such data, or sometimes they use the subnational administrative boundaries. And over the last decade, there has been a lot of interest in using gridded population data set as a national sampling frame. So there are some issues, particularly around the first two, because within the survey, we are only interested in a small percentage of the household. However, in the census enumeration area or subnational boundaries, the first sampling stage unit, they are covering thousands of households. So you have to basically conduct the second sample and third sampling stage until you reach the size of the population or household that you are looking for. But this process is time and resource intensive that we would like to avoid it. The other critical challenge that we have, and it's quite missing, I would say, at the global scale. None of these type of national sampling frame have ever considered the socioeconomic and health background, which means that the sampling unit that you are selecting could be quite heterogeneous in terms of the socioeconomic and health background. So in that case, you might be missing key population subgroups in your survey. Like, for example, this is just an example to show you what we mean by that. So this is just an enumeration area, and you can see the household. They may have like different socioeconomic and health background within the same enumeration area. So if you're selecting a bunch of household here, how could you make sure that the household that you're selecting are coming from the same socioeconomic class or health? Here is a vaccination coverage similar situation, which is always quite key in the creation of robust national sampling frame. In terms of using the gridded population dataset as a sampling frame, one of the critical challenge here that we have is actually the gridded boundaries, where they don't in line with the ground feature on the ground. So when you are selecting a sampling unit and you send enumerator on the ground, then you can see that those gridded outline, they are cutting houses. I know there has been some procedures how to include or exclude specific household based on percentage, but we are selecting a small percentage of the household. So any kind of exclusion and inclusion of the household within your sampling unit will introduce a lot of bias, and it will create a huge challenge for sampling weight calculation. The other critical issue that sometimes you may have a project that you would like to survey at the regional scale, like multiple countries together. So in this case, there are quite a lot of challenge. First of all, often those national sampling frame that are in the National Statistic Office are not actually available. They are not sharing it with you. So it's quite challenging to test various hypotheses regarding the sampling, population distribution, estimates of proportion from surveys or other outcome. The other critical challenge that we have is that they may have different input population data. So in one country, you may have population for a specific year, in other country might be different. So when we have those kind of different input data set in your national sampling frame, so it's quite challenging to estimate or establish a standardized denominators across the survey that you have. So at WorldPop, we have been working over the last few years to develop some smart and flexible approach for the automatic delineation of national sampling frame. So this is the concept behind the preEA tool package. This concept basically was inspired by the field of image processing. So we are using some region merging algorithms such as waterfall algorithm to build this model. So the process within the preEA tool can be categorized into three main areas. So the first part is when we have the input data. Input data basically includes any digitized boundaries that you have for the countries, including infrastructure, road data set, waterways, or land cover, anything that basically gives you the visible digitized boundaries. For the population, you can basically use different formats, either raster data set if you have the GPS household location, or in the absence of the population, you can use building footprints in the preEA tool. So once you have pre-processed the input data set, the tool basically just split up the area of interest into small identifiable units, which we call built-in blocks. And also it summarizes the total populations or any input data set that are given to the tool. And it has a unique ID. So once the splitting part is finalized, then the user has the opportunity to define different constraints. We have hard constraint, which covers the maximum minimum population, maximum minimum area, and crossable border. There are some certain lines or areas that must not be crossable because the enumerator may not easily cross them on the ground, like, for example, major rivers or major road. And also the EAs must be nested within the administrative boundaries. So on the soft constraints, we have shape factor. So we want to produce a compactness, like a robust like boundaries. We also have a novel functionality in our tool, which is the homogeneity. So apart from the population and area, the tool basically consider the homogeneity, which will be any health and socioeconomic variable that you have for the country. So once you have defined your constraint, then the tool basically merges these building blocks based on those functions and basically merge until one of these constraints is reached. And then you will create a shapefile, a preEA. We call it preEA because this will be the output of the tool. So once it has been reviewed, so you can basically call it the final enumeration area. So what we have in the shapefile, we have the boundaries for each of the preEA. There is no geometric issue. They are all nested within administrative boundaries. There is no gaps, overlap, and also they all have own ID and they have the estimated population or buildings or anything that you have used as an input. So the preEA tool has been actually developed using the Python language, and it has been developed as a QGIS plugin. So this is the interface of the tool. We have the input data set. We have the merging options. So within the merging options, we have actually different weighting coefficients. So if you are interested to put more weight on the population in the region merging options, then the tool basically consider the population. You have homogeneity, you have area and shape factor, and this is the output of the tool. So when it comes to developing any automatic tool, I think one of the questions that is always asked whether the output of the tool does make sense on the ground. So that was one of the first asks from UNFPA and multiple national statistic offices that we have worked across the world with them. So what we did in DRC in collaboration with the BCR, DRC, National Bureau of Statistics, and also the UNFPA country office. We did a field work in DRC to evaluate whether the boundaries that we're producing from this tool does make sense on the ground and could be used for the upcoming census. The team was quite happy with the output. They could easily find the boundaries and they could easily enumerate all the household within the suggested pre-enumeration area. So initially, the concept of this tool was tested in Somalia, but not using the actual tool that we have. But the World Bank was quite interested at that time to do a socioeconomic survey in Somalia, but there was no digital national sampling frame. So I basically just came up with two research concepts for creating the national sampling frame. First one was using the quadratary approach. The other one is a proof of concept using another tool, the initial thought that now we have developed as a tool in preEA. So those two papers can be accessed here if you'd like to read more about it. More recently, in 2023, we got funding from UNHCR in Cameroon. In almost all the countries around the world, there's always one national sampling frame that comes from the census, which basically just consider the total populations. But when it comes to the specific population, like, for example, internally displaced people or refugees, we don't have a customized national sampling frame for it. So often UN organizations like UNHCR just need to put a lot of resources to do specific survey around those type of population, but they only use the general national sampling frame, which always don't consider this type of population. So what we did in Cameroon, UNHCR has a progress database, which they have information about refugees at different levels in high resolution, but outside the IDPs were at some administrative boundaries. So what we did, we first of all modeled the refugees at 100 meter by 100 meter cell, as we do in WorldPop for general population. So we estimated the refugee population at 100 meter by 100 meter, and we used this specific gridded refugee estimate to create a customized national sampling frame for Cameroon, and this will be used for the upcoming survey in Cameroon. So this is a quite challenge. Recently, I was in Latin America and Caribbean countries, and there has been a lot of concern about using just the normal national sampling frame for surveying indigenous communities or IDP. So they were quite also interested to do similar kind of approach in those countries. Another very impactful work is the work that we do with the National Instat in Benin. So Benin is planning to conduct the upcoming census maybe in 2024, I think. So there was no digitized enumeration area in the country. So the first stage that we did in the country, we did a method validation. We created the output. We sent the team on the ground. They collected data. They were quite happy with everything. The second stage, what we did the first census pilot cartography, and it has been done very successfully. And now the country is basically just working on creating the enumeration area using the preEA tool for the entire country and start completing the census cartography for the whole Benin. So apart from Benin, we have piloted the work in quite a lot of other countries, and the outputs are quite interesting, and we're meeting the NSO's demand. When it comes to the comparison between the manual approach and automatic, I think people would like to see what is the difference between these two approaches and how that basically improves the allocation of resources and reduces the labor and maybe the cost, because that is one of the actual challenges that we have in quite a lot of countries, because we don't have much of resources. So this is just a small example in Burkina Faso, where we have a group of 8 cartographers in Burkina Faso. It took them almost a week to create a pre-enumeration area in one commune boundaries, which is called Ouaga. Once they have finished, they share the output with us, and we found quite a lot of geometric issues, and you see they're not nested within administrative boundaries. So imagine how much time and resource will be needed to create the output for the entire country. However, when we use the preEA tool, once the input data set was ready, it took us only 13 minutes to run the tool to create the preEA within the same administrative boundaries, commune boundary. And it depends on the quality of your computer, but it took only 10 hours in my computer to create the output for the entire Burkina Faso. Obviously, there was no geometric issues like overlap. They are all nested within administrative boundaries as well. The other advantage of the preEA tool is that you can actually introduce the homogeneity functionality in your tool. You can basically introduce the homogeneity functionality in the tool. So instead of having a sampling unit like this that we have seen previously, you can basically do a kind of like this, because you can use the raw data set or any digitized boundaries that we have to create the building blocks. So once you have introduced the homogeneity functionality, the tool will try to not mix the extreme class together. So it will always try to merge with a similar class or very close class in terms of the merging to create the final sampling unit. So in terms of making the consistency within the national sampling frame, you can use the same gridded population data set for the same year and use the similar approach, the same method to create your national sampling frame for various countries across region or at the global scale. So that was just some of our work on the preEA tool package on creating specifically the national sampling frame. There is another challenge that we have counted when we have been working with the NSOs and quite a lot of other organizations and countries. There is no such a tool that could basically inform the policymakers, the government, to understand what are the challenges on the ground. And if you're planning to do a survey, how would you allocate your resources? So based on this challenge, we came up with a tool that helps you to identify the most challenging enumeration area in terms of the enumeration. So imagine this is a specific location in Nigeria and you would like to enumerate. So there are certain considerations that you need to consider. First of all, you need to know where the settlement. The second part is you need to know how many peoples or household you're expecting to enumerate. And also, what type of road do you have in that area? So because if there is road, if not, you need to walk. If there is road, what is the type of road? Is it like a minor road or like highways? So that would basically change the situation. And of course, what would be the type of the land cover that you have within that particular location? Because enumerating household in forest could be different in urban area and vice versa. And of course, slope could play an important role here as well. So if I'm trying to basically consider all of these parameters in this specific location visually, it will be quite challenging. So what we did, we developed a tool, again, using the Python language and developed as a QGIS plugin to create a tool to consider all of those parameters for us. With basically, it has the API access. It will download the land cover, the digital terrain model, the road network, the building counts for that specific area. And it basically download all of them and it will create a cost surface, a travel time for you. So once you have that travel time, the other part of the tool would calculate 5 metrics for each of the enumeration area you have. So the first one is the intersettlement, which is the travel between two settlements. So if you have one enumeration area and you have more than one settlement, then how much time will be needed to travel between settlement 1 to 2 to 3 and so on. We have metrics that basically gives you the overall cost for the entire enumeration area. You have metrics which gives you the time for walking within a settlement, because often when you enumerate, you're not driving, you are going house by house and collect data, so you usually walk. So it gives you the time for walking. Interview cost is the time for interviewing the household. Let's say if you have 50 household and the questionnaire that you have developed would take 30 minutes to interview one household. So how much time will be needed for all of them in each of the enumeration area? And then the final one is just a combination of all of those metrics together. So in terms of the application of this, we have been working closely with the NPC in Nigeria because they are planning to do census and they are just about to start the work, but they need it because they have different state in the country and everyone said, okay, my state is quite challenging and I need more resources. So the country is planning to do some kind of field verification and use this tool to calculate the resources across the country and use that for allocating resource within each of the state based on this tool. So this is just a pilot that we did when we were in Nigeria. We trained the NPC and they have basically run the tool themselves and to calculate the metrics in these specific test locations. So this is the inter-settlement, intra-settlement, the total time for covering the entire enumeration area and interview cost. And this is just the combination of all of them. So just to conclude, what would be the advantage of this package that we are developing? So imagine if you are in a country and you are planning to do some sort of survey or data collection, but there is no digitized enumeration area or national sampling frame. So you can use the preEA tool to create one national sampling frame from scratch. If you are in a country, you have the national sampling frame, but they might be outdated. You can use the preEA tool to update and also keep the boundaries of the old EAs if you would like, and only update the EAs that are outdated. So if you are designing a specific national socioeconomic survey, then you can basically use the homogeneity functionality to create a customized national sampling frame. You can use the enumeration effort metrics. In literature, some people call it as a hard-to-account indicator to define the resource allocation in the area that you're planning to do the fieldwork. And obviously not just like survey, but you can also use the tool for creating zones for policy-making decision that has related to health, climate change, biodiversity, anything that you are interested in. I think that's all about the tools, and thank you very much for your time.